Good morning, students. Today we're going to start a new project in our New Testament class. We're going to eventually start what I'm calling the Modern Prophets Project, which I'll talk about a little bit more at the end of this video. Uh, what we're going to be doing is asking students to research a prophetic figure in the 20th or 21st century. And before we get to doing that, we have to spend a little bit of time talking about Jesus as a prophetic figure. So that's our first bit today. If you notice here in the image in front of you, it looks like Jesus is about to punch a Catholic monk. This is a 15th century fresco, and as interesting as it is, uh, here's what's going on in this image. There are many stories in the Gospels of Jesus as a kind of an angry person. He is critical of wrongdoing, but most explicitly against the religious leaders of his time and place. And understandably, in the 14th and 15th centuries, in which this fresco was probably painted, the religious leaders of the era were Catholic monks, so that's what our artist did here. So, what is this vision of angry Jesus? Where does this come from? So, here's what we're going to do in this short video. We're going to talk about the basics of biblical prophecy. We'll look at some prophetic writings in the Bible. We'll talk about how Jesus fits within that mold, and then we'll introduce the project I'll have you working on for the next several classes. If any of you have seen the movie Inside Out, you see we got anger down here, and as well as a painting from Van Eyck of the prophet Micah, who's kind of looking down and judging people. Uh, Prophets in the Bible are typically upset about something. If you think about the anger emoji on your cell phones, that's a pretty good synopsis of the the emotional response that you see in prophetic text. So, in the Bible, prophecy is not about predicting the future. A lot of people casually talk about, he was a prophet and that he saw what was about to happen. That's not biblical prophecy. A prophet is a person who claims to carry a message from God. So, what does that mean? In our case, though some people talk about prophecy as predicting the future, that's not what biblical authors are all about. What they are focused on is interpreting the past or providing some commentary on present circumstances for the readers in the hopes of changing society. They always want to change society for the better. Well, if you're going to say that we're going to try to change society for the better, you need to figure out what's wrong with society first. In Hebrew literature, that is the Hebrew Bible, or if you want to talk about it as the Old Testament, about a third of all of the books are prophetic works. In the Hebrew Bible, in the Tanakh, this is broken down into three camps: former prophets, latter prophets, minor prophets. Christians tend to only think about those labeled latter and minor prophets as our prophetic works. And so when you talk about the prophets of old, they typically are talking about Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Hosea, Malachi, Zechariah. You see them all listed here. So we're going to keep our focus on that latter set. Here's what prophetic books have in common. One, there's always a strong commitment to social justice. The prophetic books are written from say around the year 800 all the way through around the year 430. So in this 4th century period of literature, this subset of authors keeps coming back to a similar set of ideas. The first of which is social justice, the belief that righteous living demands that societies care for the needs and the rights of marginalized people, i.e., the poor, widow, orphans, the hungry, people who are treated unfairly in business. Now, obviously, they didn't have like the language of rights and like we think of like the Bill of Rights, but there's no question that the prophets thought about those as individuals whose lives are just as worthy as anyone else's, and didn't like what they saw they saw the rich and powerful of their society doing to these marginalized individuals. So that's the main focus of prophetic text, calling our attention to justice and injustice. particularly justice for the marginalized. Secondly, prophetic books frequently have a strong criticism of rote piety. Rote is something you do on the regular basis without ever really thinking about it, like the way you brush your teeth is kind of a rote behavior. Piety is religious actions, be that attending worship, giving money to churches, saying prayers. And what our authors are worried about is piety without a purpose. When you're just kind of going through the motions. I jokingly remark here that many of you go through chapel kind of like this. That sort of religious behavior that you do without really thinking about it, or you do in this kind of ostentatious manner in which you're trying to show everybody just how good of a person you are, the prophets hate that kind of stuff. For them, it's hypocritical. And that brings me to my third point. Prophetic books involve a condemnation of hypocrisy and corruption, especially among the leaders of a society, political, business, and religious leaders. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to show some passages from these prophetic texts. And what you're going to do is you're going to pause the video for each of the next 4 slides. And you're going to take the time to read it. You'll notice that I have highlighted specific behaviors that the authors call out as unjust and the people who are being taken advantage of here. So again, I'm going to go through the slides. You are going to pause the video long enough for you to read the slides and pay attention to not only what kind of behaviors are criticized, but who is being abused here and why the author is so upset about that. Please pause the video now and read this slide. On this next slide, please read this passage from Amos. Please pause the video to do that, and then hit play again. And our third slide here, again, please pause the video, read the passage, and then return to the video. And here is our final slide that I will ask that you pause the video, read the passage, and then hit play again. Okay, thank you all for doing that. I know that's a lot of text to read all at one time, but I really wanted you all to get a nice vision of consistent themes in prophetic works. The translation that I use here is a more modern version than is actually found in the New Revised Standard Version that we typically use in class, but I thought it would be helpful if yeah, you all saw that in a slightly more contemporary language. I hope that you noticed that though these authors are writing in different times and places and across the centuries and responding to different particular political or social concerns, that they keep coming back to this idea of justice and particularly focusing on the ways that humans are frequently unjust towards one another, and especially those who have means of being unjust. Micah starts by drawing our attention to those who dream up evil ways of taking advantage of one another, who take fields from one another, who take one another's houses, who by sheer force steal and rob. And at other times we have prophets like Ezekiel who are saying, hey, we should really be giving clothes to people who don't have very good clothes. We should be helping out those who are poor among us. You can think about this in terms of people maybe who are out of work if you want to. We should always be paying attention to the suffering of people in our society, children, widows, people who are not at the top of the social ladder. And notice that it's not just saying, hey, we should care about that, but look at these specific people and these specific actions that are responsible for their oppression. And that tie, that bridge between simply saying, hey, there are people who are suffering and this is why they are suffering, that's the real work of prophetic work. If you're being sympathetic and advising for compassion, that's all well and good, but you also have to tie it into saying, this is what's wrong. This is where we need to make a systemic change to prevent the suffering in the future. So we'll move from here to focus on Jesus as a prophetic figure. In the New Testament, Jesus is often presented as this prophetic figure, not only in the sense that he has that soft spot for the most vulnerable people in society, but in the way that he viciously chastises the leaders of his era for their moral shortcomings. First up, when Jesus first gets to Jerusalem at the end of the four Gospels, the first thing he does is he goes to Yahweh's temple. When he gets there, he sees people who have set up tables and booths. And on their tables, they're selling goods. They're selling doves, and they're selling lambs, and they're selling all of the things that people would sacrifice to Yahweh. That is, they're turning a buck off of other people's religious actions. And Jesus is so ticked off about this. For him, it's this economic abuse of religion. And he goes on a tear. He runs through the facility. He's flipping over the tables. He's knocking stuff off of people's tables. He's destroying the merchandise. He's rioting in this space. And you can imagine for the business leaders who are here trying to earn a living, they're going to be ticked off at this guy. He's destroying the property, and even worse than that, he's yelling at them and saying that they're terrible people for doing this. An actual riot's about to ensue, and so Jesus' disciples kind of like whisk him away. He spends the night outside town, and then he goes back there the next day and begins criticizing the military establishment and the political establishment. And he goes to sleep again on the outskirts of town before he gets killed by the mob then. And then he goes back a third day. So again, pause this video and read this criticism that Jesus offers of the religious leaders in Matthew 23. Okay, as you see in that passage, Jesus saves his most vociferous condemnations of leaders for the religious leaders. You hopeless religious leaders, you Pharisees, you frauds, you are roadblocks to the kingdom of God. You don't focus on the things that are important. You don't care about fairness. You don't care about compassion. You don't care about commitment. You care about how good you look. You clean the outside of the cup, but your insides are full of maggots. You're like a mausoleum, so pretty and marbly and shiny on the outside, and full of death on the inside. This vision of Jesus is kind of frightening on the one hand, but it's him doing prophetic work. He's saying that these people are doing something wrong. And he's telling his audience, and really our author is telling his readers, you know what? They might know something about Mosaic law, but you shouldn't do what they do. They don't walk the walk. And that sort of criticism earns Jesus enemies. We see here in the aftermath of these 3 days in the temple, Jesus has donned this mantle of a Hebrew prophet, criticizing the business, political, and religious leaders of his society, and that's earned him some enemies. As soon as this speech is over, the Pharisees conspire to have Jesus killed. Later that night, they will bribe one of Jesus' disciples, Judas, with 30 pieces of silver to betray his master. So that right there is our basic primer on prophetic literature and Jesus as a prophet. What I'm going to ask that you do now, you can pause the video to read this. I'm going to ask that you go to the assignments page where you will see a link to the Modern Prophets Project. You are going to be responsible for making your own screencast, the thing that we're doing right now, on a modern prophetic figure in the 20th or 21st century from the list provided. We'll check in class on the next day. I'll be on Zoom, and you all can ask me questions about the project then. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.